poussière, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, poussière, je t'aime, poussière, je t'aime. Tu m'as.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly talk show, all about the news here in Brussels and beyond. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, business is booming in the US and China, where there's far fewer green rules to comply with. So how is Europe planning to stay afloat? A blast from the past, Brussels has appointed former Italian Premier Enrico Letta to propose some new ideas to fix the single market. With so much at stake and elections looming, we're asking how Europe will avoid a sharp decline. And with the poor getting poorer, the billionaires are getting richer. That's according to new research from Oxfam. The NGO has taken to the streets of Brussels to call for a tax on the rich. A European citizen initiative wants the Commission to bring in a European levy on excess wealth. But did the idea even make it onto the political agenda? We'll find out with our panel this weekend. Andrea Renda, Director of Research at CEPS. Raquel Garcia Hermida van der Valle, member of the Dutch social liberal political group D66 and a candidate for the EU elections. And Dr. Owen Dray, Senior Researcher at the Wilfred Martin Centre here in Brussels. Lovely to have you all here. Thank you so much for being with us. And as usual, before we get your stance, let's just hear what was on the political menu of an EU summit this week.
A midlife crisis at 30? That's not Sex and the City Brussels edition, but the quandaries facing the EU single market. It was created in the 1990s to make it easier to trade and move freely across Europe. But is it ready for a reshake? A new report penned by Enrico Letta is frank. It states if the EU wants to avoid economic decline, it must integrate financial, energy and telecommunication markets more. Sounds like mission impossible, especially with so many political divisions. But with the EU's economy sinking to just 13% of the global total, and the US, China and India in the driving seat, we ask how the EU will stay competitive in the context of a war, a climate emergency and big plans to expand to Ukraine and elsewhere.
Sounds like a pretty daunting task we have here. I mean, Enrico Letta is saying if we don't integrate and reduce the fragmentation of our economies, we will essentially decline. Are we doomed, Andrea?
We're not doomed, but we need to recognize the urgency of acting to get our act together in Europe. The overall weight of the EU on the global economy is shrinking. And individual national initiatives don't have the necessary weight to really bring back Europe on a more competitive level. And there are many things that we had committed to doing and we haven't done on how to integrate better our economies. So we need to do it with a big effort and recognizing the urgency of it.
And the title of the report was Much More Than a Market. Catchy name, Owen. I mean, will it take on? Will anything be done with this 150-page report?
Well, I think unfortunately we have, another report, another election, another report about the European single market. But essentially the Letta report from a political context is essentially, a love letter to political failure, because nothing really has changed in the last 10 years since I think the Monti report was in 2010, 2011. So here we are again. So it's really down to political will. A love letter to particular failure. And we have a lady here on the panel who's running, and you'll be sending this message to your campaigners about this report and what's at stake for Europe. I mean, what's your take? Did you get a chance to read the paper? What's the good, bad and the ugly in it?
I've definitely read a lot of the summaries of the paper and a lot of the analysis. And I think that we have to think about, you said a blast from the past with Letta. We need a blast for the future. We really need to move Europe forward in the next few years. We have no time to lose, and we do need to do so in a very strategic and well thought through way. And it's about action. And like Owen said, we have had enough reports, we have reacted enough, and now it's the time to be proactive and ensure that our citizens have the means and the money in their pocket that they need.
Have we reacted enough, do you think?
No, we have been reactive.
Yeah, we have been reactive rather than proactive, you mean? Because I remember when the Monti report came out, right? It was many years ago. I saw it. I felt like I was a reader of the Monti report. I was younger, of course. Today, I'm the director of a think tank, the largest think tank here in town. I feel responsible to follow up on Letta's provocations. Of course, he cannot change the single market by himself. But we have a responsibility to be part of this. And we're going to push hard to make at least some of these really many proposals that are in the report, at least the most important ones, really get traction in Brussels.
Well, I can bet your bottom dollar that the majority of our viewers, I'm sure, didn't have time to read that report. But just to let you know, Enrico Letta did travel across the continent in order to prepare for it. He held around 400 meetings, I believe. Yeah. And as I said, he was with EU leaders this week at the summit so that they could chew over his report over dinner. We can take a listen now to why he personally thinks the single market is so fragmented.
I
realized that it is impossible to use high-speed trains to reach the European capitals one by one. I think that this little subject, which each of us already experienced, is an element that tells the story of Europe's limits today. High speed exists. It works very well, but within countries. You can travel from Barcelona to Madrid, or from Aix-en-Provence to Paris, or from Salerno to Turin. With high speed, it works very well. But when it comes to connecting the capitals, that's the problem of the single market.
De mettre les capitales ensemble, là, c'est le problème du single market.
Enrico Letta there highlighting how fragmented the single market is and using an example that we can all relate to, trains, right? But it's tricky. I mean, if it was that easy, it would have been done before.
Exactly, but I think in fairness to former Prime Minister Letta, high-speed rail is a very good example. I think if you look here from this city and you want to go to Berlin, it's, just under 7 hours is the fastest time, and you need to change in Cologne. It's impossible. But, if we want to make that happen, if we want a real functional high-speed line from Brussels to Berlin, that's going to require, multiple hundreds of millions of euros investment, particularly on the German side, because they have severe capacity issues in the rail infrastructure.
We all know about the issues that
Exactly.
Deutsche Bahn have, and now, as you say, it's an absolute patchwork. And if we do want to shift from plane to rail, of course, it's crucial for the future for our climate goals.
Definitely, and that's one of the main goals of my party's political program for the next elections. We do need to promote rail. We need to make it easier to travel by train. I travel by train a lot, also internationally. We have no system which allows you to book one ticket from, say, my village in the north of the Netherlands to Vilnius, where I tried to go a couple of years ago with the train. So we think that we should use the means that we have and also invest in the infrastructure, but also making it easier for users to make use of that. So we would like to have a European train authority which coordinates all these efforts, so it makes it more attractive for train travellers.
But Letta wants the single market to adapt, Raquel, to areas where traditionally they've always been blocked by member states when it comes to telecoms, energy, financing. Do you see any prospects after this EU summit this week of anything really changing?
Well, we have seen the failures, in particular in the telecoms and the energy side, of trying to only liberalize markets within national borders, and how much this creates a very fragmented structure. We have close to 200 significant telecom operators in Europe today. So it's something that you compare with the US, it's too concentrated in my opinion, but they really have a fistful, right? There must be somewhere in between where we can land to make the life of European citizens better and also create space for research and innovation incentives, right? That is something that is experimented and has failed. So we can now move on. The Digital Networks Act, for example, that was presented by the European Commission a few months ago, already paves the way for this. Commissioner Breton has already said he would like to see more concentration and more, let's say, less fragmentation at the pan-European level. And this is going to make the life of European citizens better, just as the life of German citizens, if we actually do something about Deutsche Bahn, they make a lot of fun about it, will become much better, and perhaps they'll thank the EU for it.
Perhaps we'll have to wait and see. Raquel, just a comment from you, and then I want to look into how that report as well says Europe is falling further and further behind the US.
Following the lead of Commissioner Breton, obviously liberal parties in Europe do want to deepen the integration of our markets, energy market, telecom market, but also the financial markets. Let's make sure that our companies, our businesses have access to more capital in Europe.
And talk about SMEs. I mean, they are the backbone, so-called backbone of Europe, but obviously suffering from a lot of difficulties working currently in the single market against the competition of the big industry.
Well, exactly. And I think, in all the reports about the single market, it is capital markets union is absolutely key. And, for ordinary people, that just means, moving money and capital around Europe in different countries, being able to borrow money, transfer money, save money on kind of a pan-European scale. And I think that's absolutely critical, not just for SMEs. I think the really important point is if we want to build momentum and support for single market among people and among politicians, we should just focus on one or two key areas instead of having our efforts dispersed over multiple areas.
So which areas?
I would say, given the experience of the last couple of years, the obvious one is energy. I think it's classic, but we've been here before. After Russia marched into Crimea in 2014, we had Commission President Juncker and the Energy Union. So but I think energy is something that people can relate to, and it's about interconnecting energy systems and
grids,
our security.
And making smart use of the current infrastructure, and making sure that we can reuse it in a cheaper way for new sustainable sources of energy. In the Netherlands, we have hydrogen, for example, and we can use a lot of the current infrastructure to make the transition to the clean economy.
But when it comes to hydrogen, I was looking at some figures, and we're on the bottom of the world scale if you look globally. Unfortunately, Europe is the bottom of the list in a number of areas. But as you can imagine, there's been a flurry of reactions to the letter report this week from NGOs, consumer groups, industry groups, and also think tanks have been having their say. And just to follow up on what you've been saying there about energy, we can bring in now the reaction from Jacob Haffele. He was chief economist from the Zoe Institute.
Look, the biggest problem with EU's competitiveness right now is a two-speed Europe with European economic powerhouses establishing the majority of clean industries at home. Economically, that doesn't make much sense. For instance, 60% of Europe's solar production still happens in northern countries. That's really inefficient. What we have to do instead is producing clean energy where it's cheapest and relocating energy-intense industries to places where there's a lot of wind and sun. That way we can cut costs and make Europe more competitive. And this is a real win-win. It brings competitiveness to Europe as a whole and jobs and investments to economically left behind regions. And to make that happen, we need a united industrial deal with a clear strategy to establish green production in places with the biggest regional advantages and the financial support for left behind regions.
Jacob Haffele there with what sounds like a practical solution, but again, it would have been done if it was easy to create this united industrial deal. Right, Andrea?
Well, I'm not particularly sure, because it's different to consider something completely anew or to have failed in doing something else. For example, we know today that if you try to rest on state aids to develop an industrial policy for Europe, these state aids will always go to the same pockets. And largely, Germany has been able to capture the majority of them, in particular during the pandemic, right? Having integrated spending at a pan-European level is something that both Draghi and Letta, but also Commissioner Gentiloni have been advocating over the past. We need to do it well, because there's one thing worse than doing nothing. It is wasting 500 billion euros a year, okay? So we want to do it properly in a way that, in my opinion, the Letta report captures well, which is trying to spend at a pan-European level, but also give a chance to each and every portion of the European territory, what he calls the freedom to stay, meaning leaving no zip code behind, which is my expression on this, of course.
Leaving no zip code behind. You mentioned Draghi. You're referring, of course, to Mario Draghi, another former Italian Prime Minister who's also been tasked with drafting up a report. But Owen, I'm looking at you. Do you think the current Commission and Brussels institutions have focused too much on climate policy and not enough on industrial competitiveness?
Well, I think in general in Brussels we've forgotten that the driver of our affluence, of our wealth, of our, largely our position in the world is the single market and is our attractiveness from foreign direct investment. But essentially what we've seen over the last 5 years is a reorientation away from what I call the basics of our economic self-sufficiency and our economic wealth. And it's not that we pay too much attention to climate. Obviously it is the defining challenge of the next decades. But we cannot forget the single market, and that's why I think the Letta report and the forthcoming Draghi report are in a sense a reflection of the failure of the last decade, but particularly of the last 5 years.
And maybe to complement that, yesterday I was visiting two businesses, conglomerates of businesses, small and medium businesses, who have received money from the European Union, but because they don't have the manpower, womanpower, for their business operations, they cannot use the money, among other reasons. So we also have to think very carefully about for which industries do we need people? Do we need people from other parts in the European Union to move to other countries in the European Union? But we have to be open for migration from outside the European Union in an organized, humane way to be able to fulfill the needs of our businesses.
And just on another point, research, innovation, education. According to Enrico Letta, that should be the so-called fifth pillar, fifth freedom of the EU's single market. Because according now to the report, Israel, South Korea, the US and China are spending the most in this field.
We've been going after this indicator that, in my opinion, is a little bit of very, very insufficient, but is the amount on the percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, that we spend on research and innovation, trying to reach the 3%. I don't think this is really the real problem. Europe mostly has a problem of diffusion of innovation rather than innovation in and of itself, which is also a single market problem. So the vision of living in a place that cherishes innovation and entrepreneurship, and where citizens are surrounded by creative ideas and the possibility to access, cutting-edge ideas and have a chance at trying something new. That is perhaps the most aspirational, the most visionary part of the Letta report. Very difficult to translate into a concrete set of actions. We know more or less how to do part of it, but changing the overall atmosphere and the environment around you to create this sense of freedom is a different thing, right?
It's tricky. And if you look as well at where the highest concentration of AI, artificial intelligence talent is in the world, it's India, South Korea, Japan and the United States, and not here in Europe, Owen.
Well, there are lots of cultural and economic reasons for that. A lot of tech startups still, go to Silicon Valley to get their funding. Again, it all comes back to the Capital Markets Union about being able to access cash. But I do think personally there's also a cultural element to this. It's the attitude to failure, the attitude to risk, I think, is a huge factor. And I think for a long time we've kind of hidden behind the European social model, in the sense that, well, look, inequalities will never be as bad, as in the United States because of our social model. But actually, I think inequalities are also increasing in Europe.
There is a trend that, in my opinion, is a bit different at the moment. And we see researchers coming back from the US into Europe for the first time, looking for a better quality of life. What we get in terms of figures is, of course, astonishing. The US captures 61% of the venture capital on AI in the world, China 17%, Europe 6%. But if you look at the researchers that we train in Europe in terms of education, before, unfortunately, they leave to go to Silicon Valley or Texas or North Carolina, actually Europe trains more leading AI researchers than the US. And so we have a chance, if we create the right framework conditions, and the Capital Markets Union, or the Savings and Investment Union, as Enrico Letta calls it, is one of those elements, and the availability of skills and so on. That's super important. If we create those framework conditions, perhaps we can invert this trend a little bit.
Yeah, if we create those conditions, right? I mean, it's all about political will as well, Raquel, at the end of the day.
It is, and if it comes down to the Liberals to have a defining vote in that, and I'm sure it will at some point in the near future, then I know that we're going to take the steps that are needed in order to move Europe forward, our industry forward, protect it from the threats from outside, and be able to provide the jobs of the future for our own people and people with that aspiration to come to Europe. Because let's be honest about this, it's not about now, it's about what for economy we want for the next century, and that begins today.
And that will be, of course, the task of the future President of the European Commission and the future European Parliament that is put in place, as, of course, those elections are taking place in a couple of weeks and months. But you sound very gloomy about all that.
No, not necessarily. I think, if we look at the opinion polls, and if we look at what people, are worried about in Europe, I think the centre is going to hold. The centre-right is going to hold. I think if you look at the extremes, particularly on the right, it's actually limited to 2 or 3 of the bigger Western European countries. And certainly a lot of our research shows that on issues like migration, it's not that most people are in opposition to migration. It's that they're worried that migration is out of control. And we've seen the EU act in, whatever our concerns, be it on the left or the right. So I think I wouldn't be totally...
Well, on that more optimistic conclusion, we bring this conversation to an end. But please stay with us, because shortly we'll be hearing how a group of economists and academics want to see a permanent tax on the rich. See you soon on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon. Now, one image that caught our attention recently was this. An inflatable jet outside the European Parliament trying to catch the attention of EU lawmakers to bring about a permanent wealth tax. NGOs insist that an annual levy of 5% on billionaires in Europe could raise 250 billion a year. They say while most of us have gotten poorer since COVID, and of course with the cost of living crisis, the richest 1% own half of the financial wealth. Now, this is, of course, not the first time we've seen these calls and protests, protesters looking for a tax on the rich. Raquel, what is your take on this? Are you in favour?
It's definitely a matter of fairness to tax the people who can carry the biggest burden. And so we do have in our program a millionaires tax, without wanting to put a percentage to it. But we do feel that people who have little should not pay relatively more, and that is the situation at the moment. I cannot explain that to my girlfriend who works in the supermarket.
So you're targeting even millionaires, not just billionaires. But Owen, according to a recent study, 90% of the wealthiest people in Ireland pay less income tax than the average taxpayer, many using tax credits and reliefs to cut their bills. Do you think this should be politically addressed to stop fueling anger on the streets of your country, for example, and also inequality?
Well, it's very politically attractive to come out with this kind of slogan, tax the billionaires, etc. But there's just multiple problems, and there's a reason why, there's so few wealth taxes, and why probably France repealing most of the provisions of its wealth tax a couple of years ago is the most obvious example. Now, I've read the report. A lot of economists on the left would argue that Colombia is the example. They brought in a wealth tax above assets on a certain level. But actually what we've seen in Colombia is that, the millionaires and the billionaires, they just move their money across borders. So I really think, for me, it's a bit like the corporate taxes and the OECD scheme. If you want to talk seriously about a global wealth tax, it has to be global.
Well, in reality, the majority of billionaires, the Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs, they have all their money in stocks and bonds. And if they took them out in order to pay tax, the whole stock market could go upside down. What would be your view? I mean, would you agree there with what NGOs argued, that we could see 250 billion euros in our coffers here, in our government's coffers, if we taxed these billionaires?
Well, the math is there, of course, but the math is a bit simple, meaning you have to understand whether you'll be able to capture this wealth, whether there will be reactions, meaning the wealth will just move to other countries or other ways of being invested. But the principle is there, and I think it's gaining more traction. So I actually support the idea. The idea can only be realized if Europe does it in a very integrated way and proposes a global agreement. And second, whether we establish a system of data exchanges between the tax authorities that is even more efficient than the one we have today, which is already more efficient than in the past. We're better able to capture where the money goes than we were 10 years ago. And that is already what makes this potential tax more feasible. But, the empirical reality is that the principle that many of us have in our constitutions, which is a tax system, should be progressive. Reaches a certain level where the middle class maybe pays more than the lower income classes, and then goes down in the sense that
because the middle class
very
are
wealthy.
Feeling the pain now. I mean, they're feeling really squeezed from all sides. I just want to take a listen, Raquel, to the protesters that were out on the streets there in Brussels and hear why they believe that taxing the rich would address the inequality that we see in the world.
The only way to push policymakers to indeed tax the rich is to build up public pressure, because if there's no public pressure, they're not going to do it. Their own high salaries, they basically get them very, very close to these billionaires, these millionaires, so they're too chummy with each other, right?
So the consequences for not taxing the rich is that today we've been through multiple crises, the inflation, the cost of living crisis, the pandemic, and we see that it's mainly the normal people that are bearing the cost of those crises. We know where the money is. This is not rocket science. It's in the pocket of the super rich, and so that's why we need to tax them.
They're the biggest polluters, and they're the ones who should pay the most. And if we are able to have a wealth tax on the super rich, we can have funds to help save our planet, funds to help communities that have been affected by the climate disaster, including farmers.
Protesters there stating why they believe public pressure is the only way to make this kind of tax happen. But Raquel, you're originally Spanish, even though you're running for the elections in the Netherlands. Spain has already introduced this kind of a tax. No, Pedro Sanchez there introduced a temporary one.
A temporary one.
How's that working out?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how exactly it's working. It's also a very short period of time to be able to measure results. But I do think that it's important to keep stressing, why do we do this? No one likes to pay taxes. We can all agree on that.
It's a very emotional topic, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's why we and what the members of the NGOs just said in the video. We want the best roads, the best trains, the best industry, the sustainable jobs of the future, and we want our middle class people who are having a hard time to have more money in their pockets at the end of the month. We want to pay for a lot of things. We have to find that money somewhere. This is one way, but let's not forget the companies who benefit the most from the single market, back to the single market, they are the ones who are paying relatively the lowest taxes. We don't think that's fair as this exists.
And neither do people, because according to a Eurobarometer, this is a major priority for people. 7 in 10 as well. People feel that taxing the rich and taxing big business and big corporations to support the poor would be a priority for them.
Well, yes, exactly. But I think in the short term, a much more, realistic and feasible approach would be actually to, properly implement the rules and taxes that are already there. Like there's huge national variation in inheritance taxes, capital gains taxes. There's no inheritance tax in Austria. If you're a millionaire or a billionaire in Belgium, just put your money in property because the property taxes are very low.
There's no capital gains tax here.
Exactly.
That's why we see a lot of French moving across here and buying all the beautiful properties here.
Exactly.
And tax evasion, Andrea has said, we have made big important steps the last 10 years. I think that the role of the European Public Prosecutor's Office can be strengthened further and try to see if via that way we can help, we can prevent people from moving their capital, especially from country to country.
But this is a topic that's very emotional again for countries, for member states. They would never like to see an integrated system.
There's different views at the political level. There are people who think that attracting investment and attracting wealth is a way for a country to become more competitive over time. There's the people that think that wealth then trickles down to the lower income levels, which we know it doesn't. And there's also the people that live on a daily basis, the sacrifices they have to make, and they understand that, and they see that inequality is increasing, right? In an increasingly polarized society, tax has to be rethought.
Very interesting conclusion, Andrea Renda. Thank you so much for that, and thank you to the rest of our panellists. And thank you so much for watching. Take care, and see you soon here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekend show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my guests, we're sifting through some stories that we saw across Europe. And one that caught our eye was this. Data zooming in on our drinking habits here in Europe. As according to the World Health Organization, Europeans are the heaviest drinkers in the world, consuming 9.5 litres on average in the year 2020. And the European country that consumes the most is Latvia, then Czechia, Lithuania. Have you seen this data? Does it shock you, Owen?
No, it doesn't shock. It shocks me that Ireland isn't number one, but apart from that, it doesn't really shock me. I would hope that we don't use these kind of figures as another excuse to come up with some EU policy to regulate alcohol consumption. But I think what it probably does highlight on a much more serious level is the significant public health costs surrounding the misuse of alcohol. I know that in Ireland, the data shows that 10% of the public health budget goes to dealing with the effects.
And of course, it's a linked lot to the COVID pandemic as well, and loneliness. I think Ireland is one of the most loneliest countries in Europe, according to a Eurobarometer, and the Netherlands the least loneliest. But we can hear actually how Latvians now feel about this label and what they're actually doing to address it. We spoke to the Latvian sociologist Aija Zobena.
In Latvia, we are living in a period of change, and the change of people's habits are not so rapid as changes in economic and political system. And it is also true concerning alcohol consumption. Because in Soviet time, Latvia started to become a strong alcohol using country. And older generation still prefers strong alcoholic drinks.
Professor Aya Zobena there telling us some of the reasons why Latvia has that unfortunate label, really, Andrea. A reaction to that?
There are strong cultural elements, traditions, and many countries have their own different relation to alcohol consumption, right? One of the shocking figures that we saw, not shocking for me, but shocking for the French, that we saw recently is that consumption of beer is increasing in France and consumption of wine is going down, right? So the social norms behind drinking habits are very important. Unless we change those social norms and towards less alcohol consumption, nothing's going to change. We can try shocking images on bottles, taxes.
That's what
and
Ireland's
stuff like
doing.
this.
I mean, you were surprised that Ireland's not up top, but Ireland, as of 2026, Raquel, will have labels up on the drink saying that there's a direct link between alcohol and fatal cancers, and drinking alcohol causes liver disease. Is this a good idea, do you think?
Well, I do think that member states, countries are best positioned to understand what moves people in their country, their own population, to reduce alcohol consumption. And I do think that we have to pay attention to what's happening among the youth, and that's my biggest problem. Look, I was in Brussels. When you're in Brussels and you have to deal with traffic, of course you do want to drink a beer or a wine afterwards. It's horrible. For young people, it's becoming an exit to a lot of other problems, social problems, loneliness, lack of connection with others. We see in the Netherlands binge drinking, not having a drink when you're 17, binge drinking growing up enormously in the group between 12 and 16 years of age. I'm a mother of 3 young daughters, and I do have questions and worries about this for the future. So I do think that that's where our focus should be for the next few years. How do we prevent that excessive alcohol consumption begins at a very young age?
And who should take a handle on this?
Well, I think there's lots of different things you can do, lots of policy instruments. There's real issues about alcohol companies sponsoring sporting events. We can look at, labelling. I think in Scotland and Ireland they're looking at minimum pricing, because I think what a big problem is, particularly among students, is the below cost selling by these large large retailers.
And of course there's a massive spirits industry as well here in Europe. But on that point, this discussion comes to an end. Thank you so much, Andrea Renda, for being with us, to Raquel Garcia Armida for coming over, and also Andre. As usual, if you have any comments for us or suggestions on stories you would like us to dive into, you can reach out. Our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. We're also on Twitter, Instagram and even TikTok. See you soon.